My name is Maria Dikcis. I'm a postdoctoral college fellow in the Department of English, and I'm very excited to tell you all a little bit more about a class that I just taught this semester called Race in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and how I've been integrating generative AI into my pedagogy. So before I turn to that, I just want to very quickly mention another project that I have been involved with called the AI Pedagogy Project, which was developed by a team over at the metaLAB at Harvard, which is located within the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. This just launched a few weeks ago, so this is very new content, very exciting. And essentially, the AI Pedagogy Project is a curated collection of assignments and resources that are designed to help primarily post-secondary educators integrate generative AI into their classrooms in ways that are fun and creative, but more importantly, in ways that are responsible and critical of these tools. So what's really exciting about the project is its interdisciplinary nature. So we have assignments covering disciplines in the humanities like English and philosophy and art history, but we also definitely cover topics related to computer science and mathematics. You can head on over to aipedagogy.org to learn more about the project and to have a look at some of the assignments that have already been published on the repository. Turning now to my own pedagogy, I was an early adopter of these tools since the beginning of this year, actually, when I taught a lecture course called The Dark Side of Big Data. That was the first time that I actually started integrating generative AI into my classroom, and I continued to do so this semester when I taught a smaller undergraduate seminar called Race in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Essentially, what I wanted to do with this class was give students an opportunity to think a little bit beyond the current hype around AI, because AI has kind of gone viral again, thanks to generative AI, thanks to tools like ChatGPT. But of course, AI has been around for quite some time now. So really, the primary goal with this class was to trace a literary history and think about how minoritized communities have a perhaps different relationship with artificial intelligence. So we looked at a variety of literary genres, and we were thinking about how these communities have been historically either stigmatized or marginalized because of comparisons with AI or kind of machinic forms of life, but more importantly, how they're co-opting or appropriating these tools in order to challenge racism and discrimination and cultivate a sense of community. So this is a class that is not just about artificial intelligence, but I wanted to really be kind of intentional and careful in how I was designing assignments that gave students opportunities to consistently think with and alongside artificial intelligence as they were engaging with the course material. I'm going to just talk about one particular assignment that I used in that class. Students were using a variety of tools, both text-based tools like ChatGPT, but also image-based ones like DALL-E and Midjourney. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on this one assignment. And I should say that I certainly cannot speak for all of the humanities, but I can at least speak in part to one of the biggest concerns, if not the biggest concern, around generative AI in the context of higher education. That being the fear that students are just going to use ChatGPT to write their essays for them. So if nothing else, I hope this demo kind of helps to assuage some of those fears. In the kind of best case scenario, I hope that it helps to kind of pique your interest around how generative AI can actually be a really useful pedagogical tool to facilitate students' critical thinking, but also their writing skills as well. So the premise of the assignment was actually very simple, very approachable, and there are three basic components to it. The first being that students would write a 3 to 4 page analytical essay on a primary literary text of their choice from the first 5 to 6 weeks of the class. Then they would have ChatGPT write an essay on the same exact topic, and then once they have those two documents in front of them, they would essentially be doing a kind of compare and contrast analysis this and submit a very brief reflection essay, just thinking about what the experience was like, what they felt like they got out of it, similarities and differences between their essay and ChatGPT's, and so on and so forth. So I just want to give you a quick, sense of what this might look like in real time as the student is approaching a tool like ChatGPT. So after they've written their own analytical essay, they might turn to a tool like ChatGPT and insert a prompt along the lines of something such as the following. So I just said, write an argument-driven essay on Ted Chiang's novella, The Life Cycle of Software Objects. This is one of the works we read in the class, focusing on the ethical costs of hardwiring consciousness, emotion, and judgment into artificial intelligence. So hit send message. ChatGPT does its thing. And if you've never interacted with these tools, the first thing you may be thinking is, wow, this is very impressive. It produced a 5 to 6 paragraph essay in roughly 8 seconds. It has a conclusion. It has a variety of subsections, such as the emotional toll of AI entities, the moral quandary of creating sentient beings. And then, of course, there is an introductory paragraph and then a title as well. So I'm not going to read this whole essay, but I'm just going to read what is ostensibly the chatbot's thesis statement. So it says, this essay delves into the ethical concerns surrounding the integration of consciousness, emotion, and judgment into AI, arguing that while such advancements may offer benefits, they also pose significant moral challenges. So you may be thinking right off the bat, a lot of that language repeats kind of what's in the prompt. The thesis statement is a little bit on the vague side. It could be much more specific. Some people may say that this actually kind of doesn't qualify as a thesis statement. There's kind of no real argument there. So let's dig into this just a little bit further. So I've noticed that when students have approached this assignment, they try to be a little bit inventive and creative in how they think about prompt engineering in order to get the bot to produce a better essay. So for instance, this student instructed the bot to inhabit a very particular persona. So they said, imagine that you're a second-year college student at Harvard, and then they gave it a set of cues, such as humanize your thought, avoid vague summation of the film, make sure all information is correct. So clearly they were anticipating things that could go wrong in the ChatGPT essay and tried to kind of course correct before it actually wrote the essay. Another really interesting example I came across was this very detailed, robust prompt where the student provided a lot more contextual information about the literary work, tried to be very, very specific in the hopes that ChatGPT would produce an essay that was much more nuanced and kind of specific and concrete in the way it was using evidence in its essay. And what I've actually noticed is that prompts like these, you would think would produce a better essay. They actually kind of tend to backfire more often than not because the chatbot ends up actually over-relying on the language that the student gave to it, and it just more or less ends up kind of repeating this same paragraph 5 or 6 times over in its essay. So that's been really interesting to see how students have tried to be a bit inventive and creative in their prompt engineering. So now that you kind of have an understanding of what the basic premise of the assignment is, I just want to talk about a few learning outcomes that I sort of envision this assignment to be facilitating for students. The first and most important one is that it definitely allows students to develop critical AI literacy, especially around the limitations of large language models. Given the fact that these tools are still in their relative infancy, the truth is that they're actually not that great at writing about things like literature, works of art, films, so on and so forth. They may get better over time, but as of right now, they're not fantastic at it. And I think students immediately recognize this. And sometimes it's easier to recognize the flaws in somebody else's writing than it is to see the flaws in your own writing. And there's a lot of value there because students can kind of easily poke holes in the chatbot's essay, recognize where it kind of falls short, and think about why its limitations are significant. So related to that, I've absolutely seen how this assignment helps students to evaluate argumentation more effectively. It really allows them the kind of space to inhabit the essay format and think about the mechanics of argumentation from the inside out. So I give them a kind of series of guided questions to think about how they can compare and contrast their essay to ChatGPT's. And what the hope there is that when they're evaluating ChatGPT's essay, that they'll kind of bring that critical eye and that kind of editing methodology back to their own writing when they're kind of, they're kind of taking a sidestep out of their own ideas and their own headspace and momentarily engaging with somebody else's ideas and pointing out those flaws and limitations and shortcomings in terms of its argumentation, in terms of the structure of its essay, and so on and so forth. Another significant learning outcome, especially in the context of a class that is focused on critical race studies, is that it allows students to engage more responsibly with race and identity and culture and diversity, specifically because large language models actually are not that great at handling these topics with nuance and sensitivity. And just to give you one quick example, this was a student who was writing an essay on a graphic novel adaptation of Octavia Butler's Kindred. And if you're not familiar with that narrative, it's a science fiction tale about a woman who time travels back and forth between California in the 1970s and the antebellum South. And along the way, she meets a variety of her ancestors, some of whom are enslavers, are owners of plantations. And the character, Miss Margaret, herself is the wife of a plantation owner. So the fact that the bot claimed that she subtly challenges the dominant power dynamics through a bold assertion of individual agency just completely misses the point. She herself, besides being the wife of an enslaver, is just a viciously wicked character. So the student picked up on this and kind of talked about why it was so troubling that the bot was claiming that she was challenging dominant power dynamics when of course she is entirely complicit with them. So that's really just the kind of tip of the iceberg. I've seen so many examples where the bot makes these kinds of missteps and not only just makes, kind of empty or kind of vapid claims about race or identity or culture, but actually can have this tendency to produce claims that are quite problematic or even biased. And then the last learning outcome that I think is really exciting that I've seen come out of this assignment is that it definitely cultivates a sense of community of writers. I've witnessed firsthand how students kind of bond over their critiques of ChatGPT. I think in psychology we might call this the common enemy effect. I don't think students necessarily see ChatGPT as like an enemy, but they definitely kind of bond over all the things that they notice kind of went wrong in the ChatGPT essays that they were interacting with. This came directly from a conversation that we had after students had already completed the assignment, after they received their feedback from me. And as you can tell, just based on this visual, students were noticing that there are a lot more negatives going on in the ChatGPT essay than potential positives or neutral aspects of the essay. So it was just really exciting to see how students, felt a sense of belonging in the fact that they knew they could do better than ChatGPT, and that really showed. And the truth is that because large language models do not have emotions, because they are not human, nobody's feelings get hurt. So this is kind of a variation of the exercise of peer critiques, which is very common in classes such as expository writing and things of that nature. So I just want to conclude by talking about a few best practices for instructors themselves. The first being that I think it's absolutely fundamental for instructors to learn the AI basics and define key terms for students such as large language models, training data, so on and so forth. Because the truth is that, of course, now many students have used ChatGPT, they know what ChatGPT is, but not all students know what a large language model is and understand how it works. So I think that regardless of discipline, regardless of technical background, I think we're at this point where educators have an obligation to at least familiarize themselves with the basics so that they can convey that information to students so that they engage with them more responsibly. Another best practice is that I think it's really helpful to encourage students to approach prompt writing very carefully and thoughtfully. It's certainly easy enough to just go to any one of these tools and say, write an essay on X book and hit enter, and then that's it, done. But the truth is that really what you get out of these tools entirely depends on what you give to them. And I think that it's important for students to think about and approach prompt writing very thoughtfully and very carefully, because that just makes the experience that much more productive for them and more likely that they'll actually get something out of it if they're thinking very carefully about how they're engaging with the AI and what it means when it kind of doesn't do something that they hope it does or want it to do. Another best practice that we at the AI Pedagogy Project strongly advocate for, which is that there should always, regardless of the assignment, regardless of the tool, there should always be a critical or reflective element. And that can take the form of a brief reflection essay that's 1 or 2 pages, but it doesn't have to be that. It can just be an in-class conversation where students are kind of given that space to air out some of their thoughts and kind of talk about what the experience was like, where they felt like that generative AI succeeded, where it fell short, and where they were kind of running up against limitations, and why that matters. It's simply not enough for the student to write their own essay, have ChatGPT write an essay, and be like, okay, here you go, professor, right? There needs to be that third element where they're kind of given the space to reflect on what they were noticing in terms of differences and similarities. And then one final best practice I want to mention that I feel like we aren't necessarily talking enough about with respect to generative AI is this idea of giving students the choice to actually opt out if they do not want to interact with the AI for whatever ethical, political, moral reason. And I say this because before students actually jump into the assignments, I of course give a little bit of a contextualizing lecture about large language models, about ChatGPT, and in that lecture we talk about all of the problems that are inherent to these tools. We know that they're very computationally intensive and can be quite bad for the environment. We know that the Silicon Valley-based organizations that are developing these tools have outsourced their labor to contract workers around the globe who are often, more often than not, exploited. So there's a clear tension between that framing and saying, okay, go have fun, enjoy this assignment. So really, I tell my students that we're approaching these tools from a critical perspective. And I should say that now, having taught this assignment across 2 different classes that have encompassed roughly 60 students, I haven't yet had a student choose to opt out. And I would like to attribute that to the fact that I tell them that we're approaching this from the spirit of being critical of these tools, and that you can't make an informed critique of anything unless you truly understand how it works from the inside out. And I think students really respect and appreciate that framing, and they understand the value of the assignment, therefore. So those are just a few best practices that I feel like I've developed over the course of the last year. Of course, there are many more, but that's all I have for today. So here are my contact details if you're interested in following up or you have questions about this assignment. And thank you all again so much for your time.